Hey, what's up? Welcome back to another session of macroeconomics, asynchronous online. And I hope you guys are doing pretty good today. I hope you had a wonderful week so far. I know this lecture notes, or recorded lecture video came a bit later than usual, and I just want to apologize. But hopefully we should be able to cover everything in chapter 5 today. Remember, you have a test coming up on Wednesday, and also there's going to be a review video on Monday as well, so watch out for that. Okay, so the last time we've been talking about looking at certain economic indicators. We've looked at GDP. We know how to measure GDP. We know the difference between nominal and real GDP, and we looked at unemployment rate. Okay, so we looked at three labor market indicators. Basically, we looked at unemployment rate. We said unemployment rate is basically unemployed divided by the labor force times 100. We looked at the employment to population ratio. That is basically the percentage of the working age population that is employed. So that's employed divided by working age population times 100. And we looked at labor force participation rates, right? So what percentage of the working age population are basically in the labor force? And we noticed that is basically calculated by having labor force divided by working age population times 100. Okay, now today we're going to a couple of definitions. So we have what we call a marginally attached worker, and a marginally attached worker is anyone or any worker who is neither working nor looking for work, but has indicated, maybe in some past period or maybe during some past survey, that they want a job, or they actually look for a job in the past. Okay, so that is what we call a marginally attached worker, right? And out of a marginally attached worker, we have what we call a discouraged worker. Now, a discouraged worker is a marginally attached worker that has stopped looking for a job, because basically that person has given up. Hence the word discouraged. Okay, hence the word discouraged. The person has generally just given up. Okay, so the person is just generally discouraged. Okay, so it's a difference between a marginally attached worker and a discouraged worker. Okay, so you just need to know the difference between the two. Okay, and it's more semantics and it's more just definition based. Okay, so in economics, we economists have actually characterized unemployment into three unique types. Okay, so we have what we call frictional unemployment, right? We have what we call structural unemployment, and then we have what we call cyclical unemployment. Okay, so there's frictional unemployment, structural unemployment, and basically cyclical unemployment. So frictional unemployment is the first one. So let's take a look at frictional unemployment. Okay, so frictional unemployment is any unemployment that comes about because someone decides to quit their job, right? And people quit their job for many reasons. Maybe they want to travel to a different state. Maybe they want to retire. Maybe they just don't like the job and they think it sucks. Okay, so that is basically frictional unemployment. Okay, unemployment that comes about because of voluntary unemployment. People just wake up and they decide to quit their job, right? And in some cases, not necessarily people just quitting their job, but it's people actually coming into the labor force or into the work market or job market for the first time. Okay, so graduates, for example, from school, okay, are example of graduates from school who haven't got a job, are examples of frictional unemployment. Okay, and the cool thing about frictional unemployment, at least to economics or to economists, is that it tends to be short term. It doesn't really last long. Most people who actually quit a job due to mismatched skills or maybe unsatisfaction, they actually tend to find it really, really quickly, or they tend to find another job quickly. Okay, so examples of frictional unemployment is quitting a job, retiring, or just being a recent graduate, for example. Okay, so that is frictional unemployment. And then we have the second type of unemployment called structural unemployment. Now, structural unemployment basically happens because there's a structural, hence the name structural. There's a structural or there's some fundamental shift in the economy, okay? So maybe the economy basically shifts from one sector to another sector, maybe due to demand or supply, right? Some major fundamental shift in the economy, and people lose their jobs because of that is structural unemployment, okay? So let's say, look at the early 1900s. Coal was a very powerful sort of source of energy, right? To actually power steam trains and whatnot, okay? But as time goes on, other sources of energy comes about. So the coal industry loses a lot of workers. Okay, so if you're a coal miner and you lost your job due to the fact that people don't really buy coal anymore, right? Then that's an example of structural unemployment. Or let's look at the whole wave of technology and automation, right? So there's this whole wave of automation, and automation has basically displaced a lot of workers, right? So you have the ATM, for example, or you have people actually working in factories, or people are actually working car plants, okay? Right, majority of these works are now automated, so you lost your job because of that structural shift. Is an example of structural unemployment, okay? Let's look at the newspaper industry. There's not too much demand for newspapers like there was, let's say, maybe 20, 30 years back, okay? So a lot of newspapers, lots of newspaper companies are basically cutting off jobs, right? So you work for a newspaper and you lose your job. That's an example of structural unemployment, okay? So structural unemployment happened because of technological change. For example, we actually find newer sources of energy, or maybe consumption patterns, okay? Or maybe consumption patterns, right? So maybe there's less demand for newspapers and hence people lose their jobs as a result, okay? Structural unemployment tends to be longer than frictional unemployment because those people who have actually lost their jobs, they need to sort of retrain and learn a whole new skill, okay? So that's going to take a whole lot of time for them to actually get back into the job market, okay? So structural unemployment usually tends to be longer than frictional unemployment, okay? And then finally, we have what we call cyclical unemployment. So cyclical unemployment happens when there's some economic downturn, right? When the economy basically slows down, or there are not enough jobs going around, or basically the economy loses steam, when there's a recession, when there's a depression, and unemployment actually happens because of that. That's an example of cyclical unemployment. So majority of the unemployment that's currently happened due to the COVID recession is due to cyclical unemployment, okay? So cyclical unemployment is the unemployment from an economic slowdown, usually unemployment from a recession, or maybe unemployment from a Great Depression, okay? Or maybe the market is just not doing good and people are just being laid off due to some other reasons, and that is basically a cyclical unemployment, okay? Out of these, we actually can find something what we call the natural unemployment rate. So economists say there's a natural unemployment rate because regardless, you can never get the unemployment rate to 0%, okay? You can get the unemployment rate as low as possible, but you can never get it to 0% because you always have people who voluntarily quit their job for one reason or the other. And there's always a fundamental shift in the economy, right? It's always changing, it's always occurring. So people always lose their jobs, okay? So that is what we call natural unemployment, okay? Natural unemployment basically is an addition of frictional and structural unemployment, okay? So NU equals F, which is frictional unemployment, plus S, which equals structural unemployment, okay? Natural unemployment does not account for cyclical unemployment, okay? Natural unemployment does not account for cyclical unemployment, but just looks at fractional unemployment and structural, basically, unemployment, okay? So based on this definition, we can actually calculate the natural unemployment rate. And the natural unemployment rate is basically the natural unemployment, so NU, divided by the labor force, okay? All times 100. Remember, and the natural unemployment rate, right, is the natural unemployment, which is made up of frictional and structural unemployment, divided by the labor force times 100. Okay, so which percentage of the labor force is basically made up of frictional and structural unemployment? Okay, right. So your textbook talks about full employment. I'm not really going to go into full employment. I think it's a bit advanced and beyond the scope of the class for now, at least. Maybe I might probably touch it later on in other chapters, but for now we won't go through full employment, okay? The next thing we have to look at is the cost of living. So the third indicator that actually shows how well an economy is doing is basically the cost of living in that country, okay? So basically we look at what we call the price level, okay? So generally we look at what we call the price level. And what is the price level, okay? Right, every time you walk into the grocery store, right, every time you walk anywhere you want to buy any good and service, you're basically affected by the price, okay? So we are all affected by the price level in this country, right? And it's important to know how to calculate the price level. What is the cost of living in the United States, right? Are goods in the United States too expensive? Are they relatively cheap, right? We need to know the general price level as economists, okay? So how do we calculate the overall price level in the economy, right? That is what we'll be looking at, okay? So when price level or the average level of prices is increasing over time, we call it inflation. Okay, so when prices are going up, we call it inflation. And when prices are falling, we call it deflation. Okay, so when prices are going up, we call it inflation. When prices are falling, we basically call it deflation. Okay, right. So in that sense, we are interested in the price level because we want to know, right, the inflation rate or the deflation rate. At what rate are prices actually increasing in the economy, right? Are prices increasing at a fast rate, at a slow rate? We really want to know that. Okay, so that is why we actually learn how to calculate the price level. And the general way to actually calculate the price level is what we call the consumer price index. Right, so the consumer price index is basically used to calculate the price level. And how do you find the consumer price index? Well, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, basically the same guys in charge of the unemployment rate, calculate the level of prices as well. So what they do is they use the consumer price index, and the consumer price index basically measures the average prices of the commonly bought items by consumers. So they actually take a survey. They look at the commonly bought items by urban consumers, right? And they basically look at the average level of prices of all those goods and services bought by consumers, okay? Right, so the CPI always, just like before, has a base year period. And again, a base year period is a period in which all other periods are referenced towards, okay? A base year period is a period in which all other periods basically are referenced towards. And the CPI in the base year period is always going to be 100, okay? The CPI in the base year period is always going to be 100. And you see why that is the case very soon, okay? Currently in the United States, the base year period is from 1982 to 1984, okay? So around that time, 1982 to 1984, we just use the CPI as 100, or we just say the CPI is basically 100, okay? Right, in July 2020, the CPI in the United States, which is the average price level in the United States, was basically 267. What this 267 means is that the cost of living in the United States is 167% more than it was during the period of 1982 to 1984. Remember, you compare the CPI in the current year to the CPI in the base year, okay? Right, so the CPI in July 2020 is 167% higher than in 1982 to 1984. How do we get 167%? Well, basically it's 267 minus 100, okay, because you're comparing it from this 100, okay? So that is going to be 167, okay? That's going to be 167%, okay? So that is how you read the CPI numbers, okay? That's how you read the CPI numbers, okay? So as of July 2020, the CPI was 167, so that's 167% higher cost of living than, let's say, 1982 to 1984, okay? And then finally, we construct the CPI. Okay, so the CPI, constructing the CPI basically takes 3 stages. First of all, you need to select the basket of goods. Okay, so you need to find the basket of goods and services, or goods and services that are mainly bought by consumers. Okay, so we need to find the basket of goods and services. Then after that, the Bureau of Labor Statistics basically conducts a monthly price survey. So they find what goods and services are bought by most people, and they conduct a monthly price survey of the goods and services bought by those people. Okay, so they look at the prices of those goods and services. And then lastly, using that, they actually are able to calculate the CPI. Okay, so if you're listening to this video, or you're actually watching the video, the most important thing you need to know in this class is actually how to calculate the CPI, okay? So I can't stress this enough. You need to learn how to calculate the CPI. And how do you calculate the CPI? Well, it's actually 3 steps. And you need to write these steps down, okay? You guys have a test coming up on Wednesday. You need to know these things, okay? First, you need to find the cost of the CPI at the base period prices. And I'll actually do an example, okay? But at least writing these things down will help you out, okay? First, find the cost of the CPI at the base period prices. The next thing you need to do is find the cost of the CPI at current period prices. And then finally, calculate the CPI for the current period. Okay, so there are 3 things you need to do. find the cost of the basket at base period prices. Remember, it's not the CPI, but you're finding the cost of the CPI basket, okay, the basket of goods and services, okay. And then you need to find the cost of the CPI basket at current period prices, okay. And then from those two, you can actually calculate the CPI for the current period, okay. So at this point, I'd like you to pause your video and actually write these things down, okay. These are going to be your 3 cheat codes that you're actually going to need for your exam, okay. So cheat codes for your exam, and hopefully you're actually watching this video, okay. So let me put a smiley face just there for you, right? Now, once you're done actually writing these things down, let's look at an example, okay. So let's look at this fictional country, okay. So this fictional country or this fictional economy, people actually consume only oranges and haircuts, okay. Those are the 2 goods they only consume. So those are the only 2 goods that are going to be in our CPI basket, okay. Right. So we found out that the country that 10 oranges are normally bought and an average of 5 haircuts are bought, okay. So now we're looking at the cost of the CPI basket at the base period. So our base period is 2017. Okay. We know that our CPI basket is basically fixed. So we have quantity, which is basically 10, right? And we have the price of an orange. So the cost of the basket is 10 times 1. So that's $10. And then we have 5 times 8. And basically that is $40, okay? So the cost of the CPI basket at the base period price, which is 2017, which is our base period, is 40 plus 10, which equals 50. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is find the cost of the CPI basket. Okay, now we found that, so we know that the cost of the CPI basket is basically $50. Okay. Now, the next thing we need to do is let's find the current period, okay? So let's assume the current period is 2018. Again, the quantity doesn't change because remember the basket is fixed. We're just looking at changes in prices, okay? But the prices have changed, okay? So we see that the changes in prices in the current period, excuse me for that, okay? So how do we find the cost of basket in 2018? Well, it's going to be 10 times 2, which equals 20, and it's going to be 5 times 10, which equals 50, and 20 plus 50 equals 70, okay? So now we've been able to find the cost of CPI basket in the base period, and we've been able to find the cost of CPI basket in our current period, which in this case is 2018, as being $70, okay? Now, this is where the real magic happens, okay? This is where you need to pay attention the most, okay? The CPI itself is calculated using the formula, okay? So what we did find was basically the cost of the basket, okay? Now to find the CPI is basically calculated as the cost of basket at current period prices divided by the cost of basket at base period prices, okay? So CPI in 2017 is going to be equal to cost of basket in 2017. So cost 2017 divided by the cost of basket at base period prices. In our example, the cost of basket, our base period price was basically the cost in 2017. Why? Because 2017 was our base period. All times 100. Eventually, if you're doing the math, you notice that these will cancel out because they'll be the same numbers, okay? So 2000, so in the base year, which is 2017, the CPI, and this is a general rule, in the base year, the CPI always equals 100, okay? In the base year, the CPI always equals 100, okay? Right, so let's use the numbers in our example, right? The CPI in 2018 is going to be the cost of basket in 2018, which we found to be 70, divided by basically the cost of basket at the base period price, right? Which is basically the cost of basket in 2017, which is 50 times 100, and we get 140, okay? So basically what we're saying is that the CPI is 40% higher in the current period, which is 2018, compared to the base year period, okay? The base year period. So hopefully you understand this, and if you don't understand, please pause it or please send me an email about questions you may have to try and solve this, okay? Right, so the next thing we'll look at is a class example, okay? So first of all, I want you to find the CPI in 2018 and also find the CPI in 2019, okay? So at this point, you probably want to pause the video and work through it, okay? Okay, right. So now let's just do this. Okay, so let's see if the first thing we need to do is find the cost of basket of both years. Okay, so it's gonna be 2 times 30, right? Which is basically going to be 60. And then we have 20 times 2, which is basically going to be 40. And the cost of basket in 2018, which is our base year, is basically 100. The second thing you need to do is find the cost of baskets in the current year. In our current year, it's basically 2019. So we have 2 times 35, which is 70. And then we have 2 times 20, which again is 40. Okay, so that exactly is 110. Okay, so now we need to find the CPI. Okay, so the first thing you do is find the cost of baskets in both years. Now let's find the CPI in 2018. Okay, so that's going to be the cost in 2018 divided by the cost in 2018, because 2018 is our base year, it's always divided by the base year, right? Times 100, okay? So again, we know in our base year, right, cost of 2018 was 100, so it's this 100 divided by 100 times 100, okay? So again, we're finding that in our base year, the CPI is always 100, okay? So the CPI in our base year is basically going to be 100, okay? Right, now let's find the CPI in 2019, okay? So that is going to be the cost in 2019 divided by the cost in the base year, which is again 2018, all times 100. Okay, so that is going to equal 110, because that's the cost we found, divided by 100 times 100, and we find the CPI in 2019 to be 110. Okay, so that is how we basically find the CPI. Okay, that is how we basically find the CPI. Okay, now the most important thing is that we know the price level, and from the price level we should be able to determine the inflation rate. Okay, so to find the inflation rate, you need to find the percentage change in the CPI. Okay, so the inflation rate is the percentage change in the price level from one year to the next, and the inflation rate formula is given by this: the CPI in this period minus the CPI in last period divided by the CPI in last period, all times 100. Okay, so that is how you find the inflation rate. Again, you need to write this down. Okay, if the inflation rate tends to be positive, we say there's inflation. If it's negative, we say there's a deflation, meaning price levels have dropped. Okay, so if it's negative, it's a deflation. If it's positive, it's basically an inflation. Okay, right. So in July 2020, the CPI was 245. In July 2019, the CPI was 241. What is the inflation rate in July 2020? Okay, so we use our formula. CPI of this year, so that's going to be 245 minus 241 all divided by 241 times 100. Okay, and what should you get? You should get 1.65 or 1.7. Okay, right, so that is how you find the inflation rate. Okay, so it is 245 CPI of this year minus CPI of the previous period divided by CPI of the previous period times 100, and you should get 1.7%. Okay, so that is how you calculate the inflation rate. Okay, so now let's find the inflation rate in our example. Okay, so in our example, we had 2019 CPI equals 110. 2018 CPI equals 100. Okay, so find the inflation rate in 2019. We have 110 minus 100, all divided by 100 times 100. Okay, and you should get 10%. Okay, you should get 10% as the inflation rate. Okay, so generally prices in the country increase by 10%. Okay, right, so basically that ends our foray into chapter 5. I'm gonna post homework, I think, for chapter 5 later on today, and I'm also gonna post the discussion question. Okay, again, if you have questions, I know it's really hard on this online class, but just please watch the videos, and if you have questions, don't hesitate to ask. Okay, thank you very much.